Welcome to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, a podcast that brings personal stories from transplant survivors, their families, friends, and loved ones. This is where you will hear challenges and triumphs of everyone involved in this journey. Our guests will offer wisdom, advice, and inspiration on everything you want to know about transplant. My name is Jenny McFarland. I am a transplant survivor, and this is a podcast I wish I had before and immediately following my transplant. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, Jenny McFarland here, your host of the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, where you can come on and tell your side of the story. So my guest today is an incredible guest, and I just want to mention before I get into my little intro that I titled this episode based on the advice that she gave at the end of the episode, because her advice at the end of this episode, I think, is fantastic advice. Don't get me wrong. Everybody's advice is valuable, and I love all of them. But this one really struck with me. It was try to live your life while you're on the wait list or something like that. And we talk a little bit about that, and I just feel like it's not just transplant related, that advice. I feel like if you are struggling with something, anything, a physical condition, a mental condition, chronic illness, you're on the transplant wait list, you have to still try and live your life. If you are alive, then live your life. And sometimes that's difficult, and sometimes there's challenges with that. But I feel like, you got to take advantage of your time here on Earth. So I just think it was great advice, so that's what I wanted to title it. So I just wanted to explain that to you guys. And if you are listening to this in real time, next week on April 19th, the Pre to Post Transplant Foundation is having a event. We're having our monthly transplant timeout, which is called the transplant timeout because we want you to take a timeout out of your day and learn something new about transplant. And this month we are having somebody come on and talk about how to write your donor family. And she's done this talk many a times. I've seen it before. It's an amazing talk with great information on how to write your donor family. And so if you want to join in, it's free, but you do have to register. So you can log on to the foundation's website at www.pretopost.org and sign up. It's going to be at 12 noon Central Standard Time on Zoom. So you can be anywhere in your car, at work, at home, whatever, and learn how to write your donor family. And so that is all I really wanted to say, except for, of course, please try and leave a rating and review. I need more of those. I don't have as many as I would like. So if you would kindly just go onto the Apple Podcast platform and leave the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast a review, that would be so amazing of you guys. Okay, that's it. That's my ramble for today. So let's go ahead and get on to the episode, and you can hear this great story of Lorrie Hill, who had a heart transplant, and she has an incredible, amazing story. So without further ado, please help me welcome my guest, Lorrie Hill. Hi, Lorrie. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm glad you're here. So first, tell me, when you had your transplant, where you had your transplant, and why you needed a transplant.
Yes, so I had my transplant just 2 years ago at Texas Children's Hospital, and I had it due to a single ventricle congenital heart defect.
Okay. And what was the date that you did it?
It was March 31st of 2021.
Oh, so you're coming up on your transplant anniversary.
Yes. Very
so
exciting.
It was a heart transplant?
Yes, heart transplant.
Okay, perfect. So 2 years, how exciting. So I'm only 4 years out, going on my 5 years, and I had my transplant in Houston also. So
Mm.
I just moved to El Paso like in September of last year, but I lived in Houston for 4.5 years.
Okay,
So
that's
yeah.
awesome.
So tell me a little bit about your condition, why you what led up to getting a transplant.
Yeah, so like I said, I had a single ventricle congenital heart defect. I won't go into the whole thing. It's pretty complex. But essentially, a heart has two atria and two ventricle. Instead of two, I just had the one ventricle. And
Okay.
essentially, there was a giant hole in the middle of my heart, and the two
Oh.
valves that are supposed to be in the heart had all morphed into one.
Oh.
And so growing up, I had three open heart surgeries to try
Oh.
to replumb the vasculature in my heart and around my heart. And for me, my heart was always just such a like an oddball that the surgeon had ideas going into the surgery and had like tentative plans, but he always ended up having to like scrap them and try something different.
Yeah.
And so that I had my first surgery just before I was 2 years old, and then I had my second one when I was almost 15. I was like a month away from 15.
Oh
And
wow.
then I had my third kind of last ditch open heart the summer after my sophomore year at Texas A&M University. And so that one was he went in with like six different plans and none of them worked. And so after that, we kind of waited to see what would happen, and we kind of knew that transplant was going to be next, but we wanted to push the time. Um, as doctors say, your original organs are always better than
Yeah.
transplanted organs.
Yeah.
But you do have to kind of play that game and be like, okay, when is it time that a transplant is going to be better than what I'm living with now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So growing up, did you kind of know ultimately you were going to need a heart transplant, or did that just kind of come up whenever they couldn't figure out what to do with the heart?
I think for me it was always kind of on the back of the table since I was like 8 or 10, and I kind of started to know like what was actually happening to me. My parents and my surgeon were always like very conservative in their treatment, and they're like, "Oh, you'll be fine. Like we'll just do what we need to do along the way." And by the time I went to A&M, I was just struggling so much. One of my biggest issues with the heart and they weren't really able to fix was my O2 saturations
Mm.
at rest were about 80.
Oh
And
wow.
whenever I did anything, they would just like plummet down into the 70s and 60s. So walking around the huge campus like A&M got to be a struggle.
Yeah.
I kind of leapfrogged my way across campus on benches, gave myself extra time, did all that kind of stuff. And so yeah, by the end of sophomore year, I definitely needed some help.
Yeah.
And I mean, the surgery lasted me 2 years, and then my doctor was finally like, "Okay, I'm referring you to transplant now."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you said that you had it at Texas Children's
Yes.
Hospital. Do you mind
Hmm.
sharing how old you were when you had your
Yeah,
transplant?
I was 24. I was
Okay.
the only adult with a heart transplant at Texas Children's in 2021. So,
Okay. All right.
yeah.
Yeah, because I was kind of putting that together, like if you're in
Uh,
college, and so I
Yeah,
couldn't, yeah.
yeah. Well, it was interesting because my transplant team called up the other three transplant centers on Fannin, and they were all like, "We don't want that anatomy." Like, they didn't even evaluate me. They just kind of saw the intro paperwork and they're like, "No, we're not doing that."
Oh, wow.
Because when I had my transplant, they had to take down all the other surgeries that I had as well. So it
Yeah.
wasn't like a simple, take one out, put one in. They had to kind of undo some of the work that had been done.
Wow. Wow.
Hmm.
So your team at Texas Children were like, well, if nobody else is gonna take her, then we're just gonna
Right.
perform the
Yeah.
surgery. Yeah. Well, that's probably
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
Yeah.
They already knew you. So
Right. I'd been there my
yeah.
whole life, so I already had major history with them and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So just out of my own curiosity, do you
Mhm.
still get followed at Texas Children, or did they finally let you go to a different hospital?
So I'm currently still at Texas Children's, but they keep trying to kindly kick me out. Um, and I think I will probably let them after this biopsy. I told them, "Hey, like, I want one more biopsy," because they started talking to me about it, like, I don't know, 16 months out, and I'm like,
Yeah.
"No, I'm not ready."
Yeah.
But I think I'm kind of starting to get ready because I realized that they do a lot of pediatrics, which is great, but some of kind of the adult issues or even questions about, say, nutrition or exercise and
Yeah.
just things like that, they don't quite have the same grasp on as an adult center could have.
Yeah.
So I'm probably going to start the transition period. We'll probably talk about it a little bit later too, but I'm starting physician assistant school at Baylor College of Medicine in June. So I'm trying to figure out when the best time to do the transition will be because I don't necessarily want to do it in the first like month or two of that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you have a choice of which one you get to go to? Or
A
is
little bit. I think I might end up at St. Luke's. Plus I'll kind of be in the Baylor College of Medicine family anyway, which runs St. Luke's. So
yeah.
we think it'll
So since you had all these other things going on with your heart and they had to kind of maneuver around that, did that cause any well, two questions on that. Did that cause any like extra complications afterwards or even during the surgery? And and I already forgot my second question. That's called transplant brains.
You're good. I think one of the biggest thing is I just had so much scar tissue just in my whole chest because it had been opened up 3 times and so shown shut 3 times and
Yeah.
healed 3 times that it was just crazy. And I had a professor in college who it was a biomechanics professor and his favorite saying was that scar tissue is like Bondo. Doesn't care what it sticks to, it'll stick to it. And so it took them I had a CT about a few hours before I went into surgery, and it still took them about 10 hours to just navigate around the scar tissue.
Wow.
Or maybe not that long, but it took them a long time to navigate around scar tissue. And we just had to see like where the heart was in comparison to the sternum, and it ended up being pretty close there. But my only major complication that might have been from the congenital heart anatomy after was I had a lot of fluid retention, a lot.
Yeah.
And so I was on those IV diuretics for quite a while after
Yeah.
transplant. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought of my other question.
Uh-huh.
Um, so you have a heart transplant, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but you have a heart transplant, but for like a regular standard heart transplant, and then you have your kind of heart transplant where they had to go through all the scar tissue. Do you have to do anything differently that you know of compared to like a person with just the standard heart transplant? I hate calling it that because it's there's no standard heart transplant, but
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I don't think so. I mean, again, the other way is not my experience. I don't know. In a way, I know this is gonna sound weird, but I wasn't super nervous for surgery. Honestly, going back for the transplant felt like another open heart surgery,
Yeah.
which again sounds weird coming out of a person as young as me's mouth.
Yeah.
But I wasn't super anxious about it. I knew what was coming, essentially. And so I knew like as soon as I got extubated, they're gonna want to get me out of bed. And like I knew that they were gonna have me walk as soon as possible and do all these things. So I
Yeah.
kind of also knew the recovery plan already, which I
Yeah.
think was really helpful. And I had done it a couple times before, and I even like trialed and errored on things before, um, as part of the recovery. So I was pretty ready for it, and I knew what was coming.
So for each open heart surgery, did they just go in through the same scar each time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So that
Kind
makes
of.
it nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one scar, but teenage me when I
Yeah.
was like 15 didn't want to wear sunscreen on my scar, and so of course the top half is just like super red even now, and I'm like, okay, cool. Paying for the consequences later, it's
Yeah.
fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how was that? So you said you went after your junior year or during
Mhm.
or after. Were you able to go back to college after, or are you still kind of waiting for that?
Yeah, I went back to school. I always had my heart surgeries during the summer, so I wouldn't
Okay.
have to miss a whole lot of school.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I went back in August and I got back to it. Funny enough, my major was actually exercise physiology, so
Hmm.
that's why I took like a biomechanics class. I took a lot of A&P classes, and that's anatomy and physiology. I took some exercise classes even, which is pretty funny, but I made it through. My favorite B that I had in college was a class that actually tested your physical abilities,
Uh-huh.
which I didn't have a whole lot at that point, so that
Yeah.
was interesting. But yeah, I went back to college and I did another 3 years. I had to slow down a lot,
Yeah.
just because my body couldn't handle it anymore. And before that surgery, I went into college with a plan to become a physical therapist. And so that's why I chose my major and all that. And I was shadowing one spring, I think it was the spring after my surgery, and I was doing like some inpatient shadowing and I loved it, but I like couldn't keep up. And for a while, like my doctor had been telling me, hey, like PT isn't going to be the best option for you, like going, in the long run, you're just not going to be able to keep up. And so I think shadowing and not being able to keep up like actually showed that to me.
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of a career crisis, quote
Yeah.
unquote, um, during my junior year, so my 3rd year there. And I loved my major so much, I didn't want to like switch or anything, and I was already too far in,
Yeah.
um, so I just finished it, and I ended up deciding to go the public health route. And so I did I did 5 years at A&M, and so my 5th year is when I went through all the transplant stuff. So that August, my doctor referred me to transplant, and I met with the transplant team for the first time in September.
Okay.
And then since I was an upperclassman, I didn't have a whole lot of finals. So instead of finals week, I went for my transplant evaluation week
Wow.
in late December.
Yeah.
And yeah, we did the whole week. I mean, people know it's 8 to 5 days if you squish it all together. And they still weren't done testing me after that week, so I had a few more appointments throughout December and January.
Yeah.
And I finally ended up getting listed on February 24th of 2020.
Wow.
And then, of course, we know in March the world shut down for
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
And so I finished out my classes kind of online and remotely with a friend, living in our college apartment with none of us like going anywhere.
Yeah.
And in May, I moved to Houston and I finished waiting there. My TCH kind of gives about a 2 hour time allowance
Yeah.
for your radius. And they kind of gave me a little extra time at A&M because they knew I wasn't going to be getting called anytime soon. Um, so yeah, then I
Wow.
moved to Houston and it wasn't a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And you still live in Houston now?
Yeah, I still live in Houston.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot to handle as a college
Yeah,
student. Like I couldn't
yeah,
imagine going through that in that time of my life. Like I mean, I
yeah,
had a lot of health problems, but I didn't like transplant is a whole different ball game. So going through
yeah.
transplant, navigating through college, and it's great that you were able to do that and you kept going after your transplant. That's
Yeah,
a big
yeah.
deal.
Well, what's even crazier is after I finished my bachelor's, I actually started a master's in public health at UT Health in Houston.
Hmm.
And since COVID was happening, it was all online.
Yeah, which makes
And
it easier.
so
Yeah,
I did my MPH through all of my transplant stuff. I even admitted myself to the hospital for like the last month and a half, 2 months of the wait, and I could do my work there because all I
yeah,
needed was an internet connection,
yes.
and it gave me something to do, which was nice.
Yeah, I guess COVID had some perks, right? You were
Hmm.
able to do everything online.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's the only good thing about COVID. And also, I always say, good thing about COVID was because even before COVID, transplant recipients had to wear masks. And so
Right.
I was always out in the mask and nobody wore masks yet. And everybody's staring. And
Yeah.
finally, when COVID came, everybody was wearing a mask. And I felt finally I can fit in. And so now we're kind of going back to the no
I know
mask
people are
thing.
starting to stare again. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
don't do it. It's
Yeah.
okay.
So how are you feeling now? How are you doing now after two
I'm
years?
feeling really good, like really good.
Good.
Um, I am really big into exercise. I kind of always was. But one thing I could never do was run. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of become my post-transplant love.
Yeah.
Uh, Today I ran about 3 miles,
Wow.
and when I got home, I like flipped on Facebook and I saw like the memories from
Yeah.
2 years ago, and I was impatient. I had just been allowed to go outside for the first time in like a month
Hmm.
or more. And I was on IV Milrinone, and it's just crazy how much has changed in 2 years.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, transplant has just given me a quality of life that I like never had before.
Yeah.
Um, I know a lot of people who end up getting transplants, they have some years of life that they're quote unquote normal, like they're fine,
Yeah.
until illness hits. But for me, I was always in and out of heart failure throughout my
Yeah.
whole life. And so just like not being in heart failure is crazy. Oxygen is fantastic. Yeah, it's just, it's so wild to just have a full oxygen saturation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like day 12, my I had a physical therapist who we went to a stairwell, and I had this PT the whole entire time I was inpatient, so we knew each other really well. And she's like, "Okay, we're gonna walk up some stairs." And stairs were something of nightmares for me, but they weren't as bad as ramps
Yeah.
or hills.
Yeah.
But I was like super nervous, but she's like, "You'll do fine, you'll do fine." And so I climb up one flight and I was like, "Whoa, okay, is this a fluke?" And then we climb up another flight. She's like, "You're doing it." And I'm like, "Can I go one more?" She's like, "Okay." So we got to the top of the third flight of stairs and we all just like cried together because it was like, whoa. And so just it's just the little things like that that are honestly the best parts of transplant
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, I remember that too. Like just the littlest things are the biggest deal to people who have an issue. So
Mm-hmm.
mine
Yeah.
was always I could never lay down flat in bed. I always had to
Same.
sleep propped up. I'm sure you had the same
Yeah.
problem.
Yep.
And I
Yeah.
remember the first time I got home, I was able to lay flat, and it was the most amazing feeling I've ever had.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
And so now to this day, I still get to lay flat. So at night, when I just use my one pillow, I just think,
I know it's wild.
yeah, it's crazy. It feels so amazing.
I know. I remember the laying flat issue is um I was also in Houston. I was in the hospital during the massive freeze that Houston had
Okay.
2 years
Yeah.
ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the last pick line that they did at Texas Children's that period of time. But with that, I had to like lay flat on an IR table and I just like couldn't breathe. And I'm like, can you please raise this somehow? And they like couldn't figure out how to raise the bed. Like it wouldn't be possible. And I'm like, okay. So they
Yeah.
eventually like found a pillow and put it under my shoulders, but it was still crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. When I went for my one of my tests was I had to go in, they had to measure my lungs, and
Mhm.
the guy had to I couldn't wear my oxygen, and he had to hold this thing over my face, and I had to hold my breath for like I think it was like 7 seconds, but I felt like I was suffocating, and finally I just had to stop the test because I couldn't do it because I was laying
Yeah.
flat on my back, and he was holding this suction thing over my face, and I couldn't have my oxygen on. It was insane.
Yeah, that sounds awful.
Yeah. So have you been able to meet your donor family yet, or
I have not. I've written twice, and all that I know is the heart flew, and it was on ice for 120 minutes.
oh
That's
wow,
all I got.
wow.
Yeah,
I didn't get anything either, so I haven't either.
yeah,
But yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm so glad to know that you're doing so well now. It's so nice to hear that you're doing well and
Mhm.
What are you planning to do for your, are you planning to do anything for your anniversary?
Not really. I mean, I'm sure we'll, like, go out to dinner or whatever, but I'm having my annual biopsy on the anniversary today this year, so
Okay.
that's always fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'll actually be kind of fun. Again, it sounds weird, but you kind of make friends with the people who
Yeah.
are, in the waiting room or for heart patients, they do it through like the catheterization lab.
Yeah.
And so like I know all the nurses and they know me, and this might be my last time doing it, so it'll
Yeah.
be kind of good and bittersweet at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have one more question for you, but
Mhm.
before I ask you, I want to make sure that you've said everything that you want to say, or if there's anything else that you want to add.
Yeah. I think it's just important for transplant patients and people going through the system, to know that it's like super rocky and bumpy, but it has its highlights. And also, it's just super important to be able to advocate for yourself, and kind of be able to know your condition and be able to almost tell doctors what you think you might need, and help them help you, essentially.
That's great. Actually, I think that's the answer to my next question. And the question is, if you had a piece of advice to give to somebody who's pre-transplant that you wish that you had, what would that be? And I think
Mm,
you may have just answered that, but if you have
yeah,
anything else to
yep.
add, you can.
I'd say advocate for yourself. I think another thing that helped me a lot that I would try to tell other people, and it's not an easy thing to do, but try to live your life while waiting.
Yeah.
Um, I waited 400 days, but I was doing things during those 400 days. I wasn't continually just waiting for a call.
Yeah.
And I know that can be hard, but I think it made a lot of things less anxiety provoking for myself.
I think that's fantastic advice. That's one of the best ones I've heard. I really
Really?
like that advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because everybody's so focused. And sometimes
Hmm.
it's hard, if you're sick,
Yeah.
you're very sick.
Right.
But other people are so focused on getting that call that it's hard to
Yeah.
focus on anything else. So I think that
Yeah.
that's great advice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Lori, I thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story. And I'm so happy that you're doing so well.
Thank
And
you. Yeah, I'm excited. This is my first transplant podcast, so
yeah,
yeah, it's exciting.
great. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good
Okay.
one.
You too. Okay. Welcome to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, a podcast that brings personal stories from transplant survivors, their families, friends, and loved ones. This is where you will hear challenges and triumphs of everyone involved in this journey. Our guests will offer wisdom, advice, and inspiration on everything you want to know about transplant. My name is Jenny McFarland. I am a transplant survivor, and this is a podcast I wish I had before and immediately following my transplant. Thank you for listening.